Today we're talking about GMO feeds and their safety concerns as main ingredients in our horses' diet. GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are genetically engineered in order to enhance them with new traits through adding, removing, or modifying genes. Do you want your horse to be strong, healthy, vibrant, and resilient? Do you want to proactively prevent illness and injury and have your horse recover with ease when challenges do arise? Welcome to Hale and Hearty Horses, your trusted hub for equine wellness and holistic care. Hi, I'm Dr. Rebecca, and I'm your host. Today we're talking about GMO feeds. These bioengineered foods are used in both human and horse consumption. Crops used in equine feeds that are commonly GMO are things like soybeans, wheat middlings, beet pulp, canola, and some other vegetables. They are modified to be resistant to pathogens and herbicides. In fact, they are genetically engineered to produce their own pesticide. So this sounds great, right? Not so fast. The changes in the DNA cause changes in the RNA, which then causes changes in the protein structure. These changes in the proteins in food have been linked to things like gut dysbiosis, food reactions, low-grade inflammation, allergies, autoimmune issues, and damage to epithelial cells. And in connection with our last episode, changes in the microbiome. GMOs affect weight gain, obesity, and metabolic syndrome, as well as contributing to the whole host of chronic diseases. In addition, the body usually recognizes these different proteins as foreign, leading to a chronic heightened immune response and eventually a dysfunctional immune system. In fact, in the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, a paper titled Survey Reports Improved Health After Avoiding Genetically Modified Foods, the following research and concern were raised with and about GMO foods. Glyphosate is an herbicide that is used a lot in genetically modified foods. So genetically modified foods are resistant to herbicides like glyphosate. So glyphosate, most people know of as the common herbicide Roundup. And this genetic modification means that glyphosate actually doesn't have the same action on the genetically modified food as it does on most plants. This is how they can use glyphosate throughout the growing process of the crop, and the crops still live, function, grow, produce the fruit or vegetable that they're supposed to produce, and then all the weeds are then killed out. In this survey, there's a lot of health issues that were raised about this whole process, and a lot of them are linked to the use of the glyphosate. So, number one, glyphosate actually binds to minerals in the soil, which actually inactivates them for use in the body. So it binds them up and the body can't then use the minerals. And given that our soils are already depleted in minerals, this just actually makes the matter worse. The second thing is that GMO makers determine if their food is safe, which a lot of times people think is a clear conflict of interest. This is sort of like the fox watching the hen house type of scenario. Number three, there's actually no human clinical trials that were done prior to the introduction of GMOs. So there's a lot of concern about their safety and whether they should have been introduced into the market to begin with. Number four, the DNA of GMO foods is about 2 to 4% different, creating numerous changes in the RNA, protein shape, and the phytochemical composition of the plant. Basically changing the plant 2 to 4%, which can seem like not a lot, but if it's on very integral parts of the plant, it can be quite a problem. Number five, studies have shown that GMO foods adversely affect every organ system. This was research that was actually done in the rat. Number six, another concern, is studies in mice showed that the Bt toxin, which is a bacterium produced by GMO foods, and it's actually how they get the GMO foods to produce their own insecticide, could actually provoke systemic and mucosal immune system responses. Number 7 is that, of course, there is more increased herbicidal residue on foods. So in some ways, research has shown that they've actually had to use less herbicides with GMO foods. However, there's other studies that show that there's actually an increased herbicide residue on the food because the herbicide is actually sprayed directly on the plants, and then they're genetically modified so that they actually don't respond to that herbicide. Number 8, glyphosate is linked to increases in cancer. I'm sure you've seen the commercials on TV. Number 9, glyphosate damaged the shikimate pathway, which is important to the gut microbiome. So this is actually a pathway that is interrupted not in human cells, but is actually interrupted in bacterial cells. And there is thought that the glyphosate is actually damaging the gut microbiome through that pathway. Number 10, glyphosate actually kills healthy bacteria in the gut through this antibiotic effect. So that also has to do with this pathway. Number 11, glyphosate disturbs functions of the mitochondria in cells. This, again, is more research that's come out that was sort of summarized in this survey report. And number 12, glyphosate mimics estrogen and disrupts the endocrine system. Number 13, glyphosate causes organ damage in mice. So the research shows that mice that were exposed to high glyphosate levels actually had organ damage. And number 14, according to this paper, glyphosate reduced digestive enzymes and alters the healthy gut bacteria. There's a couple pathways there that we're seeing that the gut bacteria can be influenced by the use of these herbicides. In this study, actually, that I just referenced, where they said the following problems, when human participants actually stopped eating GMO food, 85% of them said their digestion was better, 60% of them said their fatigue was better, and 54% of them were able to lose weight. So actually in this chart I looked at, there was about, I'm going to say 20 or 30 parameters that they looked at, but those were the top 3. According to the CDC data, the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis all rose in parallel with the percentage of GMO corn acreage planted in the United States since 1996 and the amount of glyphosate sprayed on GMO corn and soy acreage. So this strongly shows, or strongly leads us to believe, that this increase in inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis is somehow connected to the GMO foods and the increase in glyphosate. Another important aspect that I think whenever we talk about GMO foods is that we have to talk about the use of this on the environment. So how does using glyphosate and GMO impact the environment? So this is another list, and I know sometimes lists can be a little bit difficult, but we'll try and talk through them. Because of this increased use of pesticide and herbicide worldwide because of GMO foods, even though a lot of European countries don't use GMO, at least quite not as to the extent that we do here in the United States, that practice is thought to contribute to the rise in cancer rates and also to the pollution of the overall water supply. Also, we see this biodiversity loss as genetically modified organisms are planted in a monoculture type farming. So we kind of have that anyhow, where we'll have hundreds of acres in one type of food, say corn or soybeans. And there's been a lot of concern over the years about the biodiversity loss. And if you kind of get into this a little bit, you'll even find that they'll have ancient grains, which are much harder to find now because of how much GMO wheat has taken over. And of course, this biodiversity is not only just about the loss of native species or other species, but it's also concerned because of the cross-pollination between the species. So we're introducing this genetic material from genetically modified organisms, and if they're cross-pollinating with these other maybe native or ancient genetically not modified organisms that we're actually, in essence, genetically modifying these other organisms as well. Of course, there's concern about the evolving resistance and the formation of superweeds that are actually harder to control. So whenever you introduce something, and we've seen this in the overuse of antibiotics, is that whenever you're introducing something that is to kind of control a species, say a species of a plant that is considered a weed, that nature has its way of evolving a resistance to that. Of course, any environmental impact would have to include its harmful effects on pollinators. So we know that honeybees and other pollinators are negatively affected by GMO and glyphosate, and of course also aquatic life. So what ends up happening is they have a weakening resilience, and then they're dying out from other things, not necessarily just dying from the glyphosate, but it's weakening them, and then that makes them more susceptible to other causes of death. The next environmental impact would be this lower seed diversity. So this kind of goes a little bit with the biodiversity, but there's concern about it threatening the future food supply. They're worried about lower seed diversity because different plants grow at different heights. They need different sun. They need different nutrients to grow. They need different moisture content to grow. And so if we're actually lowering that seed diversity, we're potentially threatening the food supply because we're not allowing for something that will grow in the diversity of climates in the world. Or if some disease happens around one type of plant, then that plant could be obliterated, and then we may not have any other seed stores for these other type that would not be susceptible to that disease. So the perfect example, and this has nothing to do with GMO, which is the chestnut tree. We have no large chestnut trees, American chestnut trees anymore, because of a blight that actually was brought over with the Chinese chestnut tree. And although we have some living American chestnut trees in the United States, they're all very small because once they grow to a certain height, the blight takes them out. So if that happens, say in wheat, we'd have to go to a different type of wheat in order to overcome that. And of course, if that other type of wheat is no longer, because of the cross-pollination and all of that, we don't have those sort of ancient grains anymore. I'm kind of making a fake scenario up here, but you get what I'm saying, and that you could fill in any food into that scenario. The other thing that I don't think people realize is that GMO farming actually benefits these large-scale farming operations, and it actually squeezes out the smaller farmer. It seems counterintuitive, but it is more expensive to have GMO foods. It's very regulated. And so the companies that make the GMO seeds also sell the fertilizer and the pesticides and the herbicides, and it becomes a very expensive operation. And then back on the idea of the biodiversity is that the GMO actually changes the biodiversity of the soil. So they've done a lot of studies in this where if you test the soil of native grasses, not only is the depth of the roots and everything so much better at holding the soil from erosion, but also that these native plants are better at keeping the microbiome of the soil healthy that GMO plants cannot. And other concerns about GMO plants is the biodiversity of the soil in supplying carbon storage or disease protection, soil texture, and of course, nutrient composition of the plant. We kind of went through that list of like what the research does or what the research shows. So I want to talk a little bit about how glyphosate actually works in the body. So you buy a GMO food. It's been genetically modified to be able to withstand herbicides. But when you eat that food, you're actually consuming that herbicide. And one of the most popular ones is glyphosate. So I want to talk a little bit about what the effects it has in the body. And then we'll get on to what we know about how it affects the horse. So first of all, we do know that it affects the gut. Last podcast, we actually talked about the gut health. We talked about the microbiome. We talked about leaky gut. And so we know that the GMO foods can actually injure the gut. And now we know from the last podcast how much that can affect overall health. So glyphosate, we've already mentioned, works by blocking something called the shikimate pathway. That's a system that plants use and bacteria use to actually grow. Now, humans don't have this pathway, but our gut bacteria does. And research suggests that glyphosate exposure can throw off the balance of our microbiome. That means fewer good bacteria, more harmful strains of bacteria, and of course the setup for inflammation, immune problems, and even leaky gut. If you didn't listen to the previous podcast on all of these subjects, it's probably a good time now to go back and listen to that podcast, because that statement that I just said will make more sense. The second thing that glyphosate does on the body is it disrupts the hormones. So we heard that a little bit previous in this podcast, but there's some studies, mostly in animals, that show glyphosate can actually act like an endocrine disruptor. Basically, it messes with the hormone signaling in the body. And that raises a lot of questions about fertility, development, and even how the body regulates estrogen and testosterone. The third thing that glyphosate does is it stresses the detox pathways in the body. So there's growing evidence that long-term exposure stresses the liver and the kidneys. In fact, one study linked glyphosate to a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in humans. That's not from drinking too much alcohol, but that's actually from metabolic stress instead. And of course, as we mentioned a little bit before, there's the correlation with cancer. So back in 2015, the World Health Organization classified glyphosate as a, quote, probable human carcinogen, pointing to these links with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Since then, actually thousands of lawsuits have been filed by people who developed cancer after heavy exposure. But here's where it gets tricky. Other agencies like the US's EPA still say glyphosate is safe at normal exposure levels. So this is why you hear a little bit of conflicting information about the safety of glyphosate, and that's why the debate continues. The final area that I want to talk about that glyphosate affects in the body is the brain. So some researchers are investigating whether glyphosate can affect the nervous system, possibly contributing to neuroinflammation and diseases like Parkinson or Alzheimer's or early signs of dementia. But we're kind of still in the early stages of really understanding that, and the science is still kind of piecing that together. So that's a really good big overview about GMO foods in general and why we need to be concerned about them. But of course, you're like, Rebecca, this is Hale and Hearty Horses. So what does this mean for my horse? So in short, it's kind of one of these cases where the science is still catching up with the use of the chemicals in equine food. So we've been using the chemicals, and now we're trying to do the science to figure out whether it's harmful or not. As I mentioned before, it would have been really nice if these studies had sort of been done before we just introduced it into the food supply, but that's not how it happened. So very little research has been done in specifically talking about using GMO foods in horse feeds. But it reasons to believe that GMO foods and horse feeds would have the same bad side effects for our horses as it does on us. When it comes to our horses, most of what they eat, especially if it includes corn, soy, beet pulp, or alfalfa, could come from genetically modified crops. And so what does that actually mean for our horses' health? So horses are hindgut fermenters. We talk about that in the last podcast, meaning their large intestine and their cecum rely heavily on microbes to break down any fiber, giving the horse essential fatty acids and giving them energy through food. Just like in humans, glyphosate, the herbicide we're talking about that's most commonly used in GMO crops, can disrupt the balance of these microbes. So some veterinarians and researchers worry that this disruption may actually contribute to digestive upset, colic risks, microbiome imbalances, and leaky gut in horses. Although really controlled studies are actually quite scarce on that subject. Another area that's a lot of concern is in this nutrient absorption. So we know glyphosate can bind minerals. So minerals like manganese, zinc, and iron, actually making them less available to the horse. So if a food source regularly had a certain amount of that mineral in them, if it's a glyphosate grown, so if it's a GMO, it actually is going to bind up that mineral and make it less available for the horses. So what the concern is that these horses that are eating a high level of GMO foods may end up with these subtle nutrient deficiencies, which could show up as a dull coat, poor hoof quality, lower immunity, just a general failure to thrive. And then, of course, we have to talk about the metabolic pathways and the detox pathways that are so important in every body, but especially our horses. So we really need to have integral health of the liver and kidneys. So animal studies have shown that the long-term exposure to GMO feeds and glyphosate residues can place stress on the detox organs like the liver and kidneys. Some practitioners actually suspect that these horses with unexplained metabolic issues or chronic inflammation, Cushing-like syndromes, insulin resistance, have actually been affected by the glyphosate in the GMO foods. We don't have any direct research on this yet, but that is a concern. And some of the research is pointing in that direction. Of course, the immune system can be affected because the horse's immune system are actually closely tied to the gut. We talked about that in the last podcast. And any change in the microbiome balance could have a ripple effect into allergies, autoimmune tendencies, or inflammatory responses. Some owners have reported fewer skin and respiratory issues when switching horses from a GMO-based feed to an organic or non-GMO alternative. And then, of course, one of the more subtle things, but I think a really important area, is in behavior and performance. Though anecdotal at this point, some trainers and riders say horses appear calmer, more focused, and have better stamina after being switched off of a GMO feed. This could be related to gut health and the gut-brain axis, inflammation, or just mineral absorption. I personally have experienced this. I don't know if it's because I pay close attention or just because I have my horses at home so I can really fine-tune their dietary needs. But I have found that when my horses are on high GMO feeds, meaning there's a lot of GMO in their feeds, that the horses have a tendency to be sort of more hot, anxious, reactive, things like that. And then when I take them away from those GMO foods, so I find a product that doesn't have those GMO foods, that they settle down and become more focused, quiet, calm, and more easily trainable. So what's the bottom line? We do not have a ton of large-scale, peer-reviewed studies on GMO foods specifically in horses. Most of the evidence that we see in other animals or from real-world observations by owners and vets, or by the studies that we see in humans. Still, given how sensitive the equine gut is and how closely their health depends on forage and microbiome balance, many equine nutritionalists and holistic practitioners recommend minimizing GMO feeds when possible, especially for those sensitive horses or their horses that are prone to digestive upset, ulcers, or metabolic disease. I just want to give this reminder that this podcast is actually, I'm not here to recommend feeds or tell you exactly how to feed your horse. That would require a personalized consult. But what this podcast is set to do is to actually educate you on the current topics in holistic equine health so that you have the knowledge to make those decisions for yourself. So I want to talk a little bit about what feeds are commonly GMO. So if you decide that you want to switch and not use these feeds, that you have some knowledge about that. So common GMO ingredients in horse feed includes corn. So corn is used in pelleted feeds, sweet feeds, and texture mixtures. It's not as common anymore because of the fungus that grows on corn, but corn is one of the high GMO feeds used in this country. And if you ever read some of the books on what all they use corn for, not just high fructose corn syrup and cornmeal, it's amazing how many uses they have for corn. But it is a conventional crop grown in the US and it is genetically modified. The second ingredient in horse feed that's GMO usually is soy. So that means soybean meal, soybean hulls, and soybean oil. I don't know if you've ever read the back of a feed tag, and we're going to do that for a couple different feeds on this podcast in the future. A lot of times nowadays you'll see that the first three ingredients are exactly this: soybean meal, soybean hulls, soybean oil. And it's a very top protein source in many commercial horse feeds. And it's a fairly inexpensive protein source for your horses. But the problem is over 90% of soy grown in the US is GMO. So you can pretty much guarantee if your horse has soy in their diet, it is GMO. The other common horse feed is a common source of fiber in horses' diets, and that's beet pulp. And again, most beet pulps, most sugar beets in the US are GMO. So there is a couple products out there that are not GMO. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Alfalfa, well, that's kind of a hit or miss. So GMO alfalfa does exist, although it's not really as widespread as a GMO product as corn and soy. But some hay fields have been seeded with Roundup Ready alfalfa varieties. The next one is wheat. You don't really see that horses have wheat listed, but they will have wheat middlings listed in their horse feed. And wheat is highly GMO in this country. There's other countries that do not have GMO wheat, but in the United States of America, most of our wheat is GMO. And the final one I want to talk about, even though basically any fruit or vegetable or any grain can be GMO. So it would be a long list if we did the exhaustive list. But the other one that I want to add as sort of a main common ingredient in horse feed that is GMO is canola oil. So sometimes that's added as a fat source, and a large portion of canola oil in the United States is GMO. So let's talk about what kind of feeds usually contain GMO ingredients. So of course it's going to be sweet feeds, right? Your wheat middlings, your soybean mixes that are mixed with molasses, your complete feeds, your pelleted texture are usually soy, sometimes corn-based. A lot of your high protein supplements will be soy-based. And of course, your beet pulp, beet shreds, beet pellets, unless they're listed as non-GMO. And some of your alfalfa pellets and alfalfa cubes and stuff like that will be GMO. So what feeds are usually not GMO or are lower risk for being GMO? While it's possible in many feedstuffs, there is some that it's really not that common. So the first one is a forage-based diet. Grass hays, timothy, orchard grass, Bermuda grass are usually not GMO. Whole grains like oats and barley are not GMO, although they can be sprayed with herbicides. So just because they're not GMO doesn't mean they're organic, but usually the oats and barley are not GMO. Of course, there's a lot of products now that are coming out that are certified non-GMO foods, or they're certified organic. Brands like that include Crypto Arrow, Triple Crown Naturals, Modesto Mills, New Country Organics, etc. A quick search can actually bring up quite a few of those products for you. Just a little side note here. At some point, we're actually going to have a podcast about the availability of vitamins and minerals and synthetic versus non-synthetic, because a lot of these brands, even though they have these non-GMO products, they still are highly syntheticized, is that a word? Highly synthetic vitamins and minerals that are not well absorbed by the body. And that really influences this pathway of detox also. So back to what we're talking about today, non-GMO type feeds. There is non-GMO beet pulp, like Speedy Beet is available from some specialty suppliers. And I think I saw recently that one of the online places was actually selling Speedy Beet. So basically, if your horse feed contains corn, soy, beet pulp, or alfalfa, and it doesn't say non-GMO or organic, you can almost guarantee it's going to contain some GMO ingredients. So last time we talked about the microbiome, and we talked about how diet, stress, medication, and metabolites affect the microbiome and then influence both the digestive system and the overall health. Well, this directly applies to these known changes that we know happen when both humans and horses consume GMO foods. So my personal feelings on this is that we should try and limit GMO foods as much as we can in the horses, whether that be because of the high herbicide use or whether that be because the protein molecules have changed. One of my main concerns about GMO foods is that you're actually genetically changing that food. Well, what happens when we introduce a GMO food that now the protein is foreign? So the genetics of corn that are GMO are different than the genetics of non-GMO corn. The genetics of wheat are different than the genetics of non-GMO wheat. The genetics of GMO soy are different than the non-GMO soy. So when it comes to this whole inflammation and leaky gut, part of that process is because our body is not recognizing what's coming across the epithelial junctions, and we're having a response to it. Well, the same response can happen to these proteins that are in these GMO foods. So that's one of my main concerns, and we just briefly touched on it up above in this podcast. Do we really understand what that's doing to other parts of the plant? And so that's one of my big concerns about GMO, is that sometimes we as humans have a tendency to go mess with things, and then we come back 20, 30 years later and say, whoops, we slipped up. We shouldn't have done that, because now look what's happened. And so my concern about it is I'd like to see more studies done. I'd like to see, with these changes in these pathways, or the changes in the proteins, the changes in the cell structure, or even these changes in the phytochemicals. So you think about, we know from herbal medicine that phytochemicals are used a lot in plant medicine, and we know in cancer research to actually cause apoptosis, actually cause the cancer cell to die. If you are switching and you're changing those isoflavones and all those other parts of the plant while you're also genetically engineering them to be resistant to pesticides and herbicides, then you are actually changing the way that plant works in the body. And it's just not even with herbal medicine. We use food as medicine all the time. And we're going to go deeper into that in other podcasts where we talk about the energetics of food and how you can use food via the Chinese medical system as actually treatment for problems. That's called Chinese dietary therapy. And if we change the structure of the food, it is no longer going to have those properties that we are using it for. And so that is, as a holistic practitioner, that is one of my main concerns. And so when I look at this holistically, and I look about how we want to give the body everything it needs to heal itself. And some of those systems of holistic medicine are centuries old. And so we're kind of messing with that entire system. We start to change what the things are that we use to balance the body with. So we talk about, we want a balanced diet free of chemicals that don't stress the detox pathways. We talk about these phytochemicals that are present in certain foods and how we use them to heal the body, or these phytochemicals that are in herbal medicine and we use them to heal the body, and how that all changes once you introduce GMO. So my advice, giving all of these unknowns of how the body actually processes these GMO proteins, how they are different from naturally occurring ones, and the environmental impacts of GMO farming, the link to chronic disease states, even if we can't explain it 100% right now, the binding of these chelators, these minerals that make them unavailable to the body, that for me, GMOs should be avoided in the horse's diet as much as possible. So this opens the door for a lot more talks from here forward about some of the things I mentioned about what kind of diet then do I recommend for horses, or what kind of things do we want to look at when it comes to healing the microbiome, healing leaking gut, and of course we're going to talk about ulcers in depth at some point. So we're going to continue down this journey because I want to lead you on a path that you have clear instructions of how to take your horse from maybe so-so health to vibrant health. And if we look at the horse holistically and we do our research and we educate ourselves, we have that power in our hands. Okay, that's the conclusion of episode 3. Join me next time here at Hale and Hearty Horses.